What's up, everybody? This is the deepest sunken city that I've ever come across that's connected to the oceans. I know the Black Sea and, well, now even Lake Michigan has human settlements pretty far down, but they can still explain those away within their Ice Age melting glacier paradigm. But this one, discovered back in 2000, 2001, has been pretty well kept under wraps because they don't want to have to rewrite the whole history of the world. So, after 23 years, a firm conclusion has yet to be reached. Yeah, I bet. So, this is located in northwest India in the Gulf of Cumbet. And I'm still standing by my theory that anytime you find any of these sunken, buried, lost civilizations, then it's going to be national park land. Because some people still have the old maps of the old world. The city is 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, which is basically the size of San Francisco east of the 101. And it's located at a depth of 36 meters or 120 feet underwater. And this is located about 200 miles from the ancient city of Dwarka that the Mahabharata says sank to the bottom of the sea after Lord Krishna left this earth. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but there's there's evidence all over the place that disputes the official model of history where everybody's supposedly in the Stone Age at this time. Like most good discoveries, this was made completely by accident. They were using pollution or sonar to track pollution when they identified all of these geometric structures. And just so you know, those are the only authentic images that I can verify. Even though this one is listed, I'm not sure that it's real. So these are just stock images to give you guys something to look at. I don't like it when creators switch and don't tell people. But so they discovered it with sonar. They did send dive teams down. They recovered pottery, beads, sculptures, sections of walls, human bones, and teeth. And to me, that's a huge indicator that something catastrophic happened here because the ancients held the remains of the deceased in very high regard. And if you've seen how they conduct underwater digs, they use these huge underwater vacuum cleaners, basically, and just start sucking up all of the debris. So to find human remains out on a street when you're just digging through the sediment layer, it says that something big happened here. This is one of the few authentic images, and they're saying that carbon dating puts it at 4900 BC. At another spot in the article, they say it's 9500 BC, right about the time frame that they date the Lake Michigan discovery at. Now, I think carbon dating is academic snake oil, and I've seen actual scientists prove that these are off by orders of magnitude at times. Just so you know, when submitting an item for carbon dating, you have to list the depth and the cultural layer that you found it in. And what do you know? The carbon dating always confirms the cultural layer date. But they pretty much have to date all this right at 9,000 years so that it falls in line with their glacial melt theory of the Ice Age. But this one paragraph right here destroys that whole narrative. Because officially in this time frame, mankind was supposed to be running around with flint-tipped spears trying to wipe out all of the woolly mammoths. And this is a narrative that is constantly changing. They used to say that Göbekli Tepe was pre-pottery Neolithic, and check it out, right there at that 9,000 year mark again. And sculptures are found at both of these sites, indicating much more advanced than what they originally said. This is what the head archaeologist of this site says about it, and I found his name interesting. Kid's so nice they named him twice, but the last part of his name is Aryan, which many would say is the first culture to settle this area. So he says, for decades, archaeologists have argued about the origins of the mysterious Harappan Indus Valley civilization that flourished across what is now Pakistan and northeast India from about 3000 BC. Now, our new findings suggest that the Harappans were descended from an advanced mother culture that flourished at the end of the last ice age that was then submerged by rising sea levels before history begins. Of course it's at the end of the last ice age, because they have to fit everything into that paradigm. They're not going to rewrite the history books. But here's what people have written about our fairly recent past, and then we'll talk about the ancient past. Here they're dating this at 418 AD, but I've covered how it looks like they just started slapping dates on events that were happening around the world with this book, but let's just say since the time of Christ this has happened. And basically, the same scenario is spelled out time and again in this book, but they just have different dates for different areas. The greatest and most general quake that happened, the earth in many places opened up and swallowed towns and villages. Many and innumerable calamities fell out both by sea and land. Some springs were dried up and new ones burst out where there had never been any. Make a mental note of that. Great trees were extirpated by the roots, mountains became valleys, and valleys rose up into mountains. The sea threw out its dead fish and overflowed many islands. Ships were left on dry land in the midst of the sea. And I want to get back to that statement in a second, but I want to point out here, this is the Black Sea area, and many times I've read about a drastic change in the weather. Here they're saying hail, snow, severe colds, along with conflagrations and meteors. So this is a lot like my recent video talking about 1871 and spots all over North America going up in flames while people are saying that the heavens were on fire and one guy saw a shooting star land and start a fire. But back to the Black Sea region, severe winter, so much snow fell that it was scarcely dissolved in 6 months after. And once again, everything's shaking, the heavens seemed to burn, and the Black Sea was frozen for 20 days. So there are a lot of accounts correlating cosmic phenomena with fires and severe cold weather. Now let's go back to the time of the ancients and what Plato wrote about Solon, I believe his uncle, meeting with the ancient Egyptians, who say that there have been and will be again many diverse destructions of humankind, the greatest by fire and water and the lesser ones by countless other means. Then he talks about the story of Helios, where a quote god fell to earth and burned everything up. And at such times, those dwelling on the mountains and in the high, dry places suffer more than those who dwell near the rivers or sea. In our case, the Nile, our Savior, saves us also at such times from this by rising higher. On the other hand, when the gods purge the earth with the floodwaters, the herdsmen in the mountains are saved, but those in the cities are swept into the sea by the streams. Yet in our country, the water does not pour down over the fields from above. On the contrary, it tends to naturally well up from below. This water coming up from below is echoed time and time again. Even the Bible says that the fountains of the deep burst forth. And I need to redo that video sometime because in Genesis, there are two very distinct different accounts that are full stories that are just mixed together, where if you read it straight through, it does contradict itself. One version says that the fountains burst forth from the deep. The other says it rains for 40 days. One says that Noah was on the ark for 7 days and it started raining. The other says that it started raining and then they boarded the ark. But the water coming up from below is repeated all throughout different historical eras. The official dating says that Genesis was wrote around 1400 BC. Plato was 300 BC. That other account that I just read was 400 AD. And all of them say that water was just bursting up for no reason in diverse places. And now let's go as recent as the 1300s, where great floods occurred in the vicinity of the Rhine and in France, which could not be attributed to rain alone, for everywhere, even on tops of mountains, springs were seen to burst forth, and dry tracts of land were laid underwater in an inexplicable manner. That's just 700 years ago, and that's as far back as I find any dating to be anything close to reliable. They even say that when the earth ceased to tremble, it was found that mountains had been moved from their positions. So why is none of this taught or even conceived as being capable of happening? Well, it's because academia has insisted that the theory of uniformitarianism is the law of the land. That's the idea that all geology takes millions of years and it's a very slow process and nothing ever happens in a rapid manner. James Hutton gets most of the credit for this theory, and it really came about because academia just wanted to disprove the idea of the biblical flood. Hutton, of course, being a lodge brother, and that fraternity started as a true rebellion to the Church of Rome, but by the end of the 1700s, they had been infiltrated and subverted. By who? The friendly priests that controlled all of the original academia. Now, you would think that Catholic institutions would be trying to prove the Bible correct, but that's not the case. Their true objective is to maintain the authority of the Pope. Everybody's probably heard the term Triple Crown in one place or another, and here they're saying it's the Father of princes and kings, ruler of the world, and vicar of Christ. But the true original meaning of the Triple Crown is to signify the Pope's authority over heaven, earth, and hell, which is incredibly pompous. I mean, that's a lot of hubris. So, my theory of why academia won't acknowledge any of these catastrophes of the past is the church had pretty much supreme authority after 2/3 of the population was wiped out in the 1300s. And they wanted to teach the world that the Pope was a direct regent of God on earth. And it's hard to convince people of that when the layperson sees all of these calamities as direct retribution from God himself. It's hard to convince people that you're enacting God's will on earth when whole cities are getting swallowed up and burnt down. So I think that they decided to erase all of that from our history, and they pretty well did. When JFC Hecker wrote his book about the Black D and the events of the 1300s, he started the book by saying, well, we can't even start to talk about the contagion before we talk about all of the other stuff that was going on, and that's the examples that I've been showing from the 1300s. So people like Hutton and pretty well all of the Jesuit universities came up with uniformitarianism and later evolution as an alternative to what really happened. So to come back full circle with all of this, when they find an underwater city that is 120 feet under the ocean, then they have to date this to 9,000 years ago and the ice sheets were melting because that's their official story and they're sticking with it. But let's look at their map of the ice sheets. This is where this city was discovered in India, and the nearest ice sheet is way up here in Siberia. The light blue is the glacial ice, supposedly. So how did all that meltwater get down here over the highest mountain range in the world, the Himalayas? Which, again, they say this mountain range formed from a collision constantly upthrusting for millions of years. But when I look at this, it looks like the Tibetan plateau flowed down into mainland China. Doesn't this just look like fluid dynamics where everything is flowing down into the lower ground? I don't know. It does to me. Anyway, I've got multiple ancient accounts that say that cities slipped off into the sea and that places that used to be underwater rose up into mountains in a very short amount of time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Static out.